So our close this meeting is being recorded. So Clothesbusters is the theme of our spring campaign, and it's aimed at busting fashion myths from clothing donations and where they go, fashion trends and consumer behavior, to what today's session is, so the environmental, social, and labor implications of the fashion industry. And we have an amazing panel. I'm so excited for you to meet all of them. A little bit about Threading Change is that we are an ethical fashion organization. We're youth-led, and our mission is to have a feminist, fossil fuel-free fashion future. So that is our mission that drives us and keeps us really motivated. So before we start, we're going to be giving a land acknowledgement. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Brenna. I am the Textile Talks coordinator for Threading Change. My pronouns are she, her, and I am so grateful to be living on the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. It's really important to think about your relationship to the land to go beyond kind of what can be a performative land acknowledgement at times. So if you could all just take some time during your day to reflect on, you know, the history of settler colonialism wherever you are tuning in from, and maybe thinking about your own unique relationship to the land, that would really help us go beyond, you know, just that basic step. And so if you want to share, we would love for you to share. So please in the chat, let us know what traditional territory you are tuning in from. If you don't know, you can check whose.land, and that lets you know the territories that you are on. So yes, please fill up the chat. We would love to see where all of our participants are coming in from. So now this is like our little meet the team. So while our team is currently based in Western Canada, our work is very global in reach, and we have team members coming in from, you know, Canada to India to Trinidad. Some people are from China, so it's a really amazing, diverse team, and we're so grateful to be learning from everybody. Sophia is our founder and executive director, and she's just going to take a few seconds to introduce herself and some of the team members. So Sophia, take it away.
Hi everyone, so nice to see and meet you all. My name is Sophia. I use she, her pronouns. I'm really grateful to be with all of you here today in honor of Fashion Revolution Week. I've been having lots of different conversations with people about ethical fashion for the last year, and it's great to see all the efforts culminate with amazing panelists coming from all walks of life. We are an international youth-led organization. To us, youth are not just the future, we are the present, making waves in the fashion industry in a world of climate justice. And we're so thankful of our team members, some of us who are here today, Fernanda, who's our Assistant Director of Development, Carissa, who's our Communication Engagement Manager, and also many more coming from all areas and of the world. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our Mixer event next week. On to you, Brenna.
Thank you. Okay, so just a quick little background on what we do. So we work at the intersections of consumer education and industry transformation through our 4 impact models. So as you can see, you're now taking part in our Textile Talk series, which is more geared towards education and awareness. And then we have our global innovation story map, where we like to connect and create a story of all of the global ethical fashion brands around the world to help bridge that gap. And we just may not have access to some of those amazing brands. So that's what we help to do with that. And then we also offer youth engagement and consulting. And then we also have our SDGs program. For anyone that doesn't know what the 17 SDGs are, you can check it out at un.sdgs. And we are working on the Sustainable Development Goals there. So today's programming, we're just going to have a little panelist introduction, and then we're going to have our meat and potatoes, which is our panel discussion. We're going to go through some upcoming events, ways to stay in touch with ourselves and our panelists, and then a Q&A period. So like I mentioned in the chat, if our panelists are speaking and there's something that you find really interesting that you want to have some questions answered for, please just pop it in the chat. Carissa will be minding the whole conversation, and she'll be letting me know what questions we want to ask at the end. So please give us your questions. So now the fun part. So meet all of our amazing panelists. You will see them speaking. So first we have Roger Williams. He's an award-winning producer, director, and cinematographer, notably known for the documentary RiverBlue. He also has created Inspired Image Picture Company, one of the largest rental and production service companies in Canada. So thank you so much, Roger, for being here. We're so grateful to have you. And then we have Aditi Mayer. She's a sustainable fashion blogger, photojournalist, labor rights activist, and speaker on decolonization, social and environmental justice. She has an amazing Instagram presence. She's always educating and always putting herself into webinars and things that she can speak and share her knowledge from. Her journey started in 2014 when she learned about the Rana Plaza collapse, and we'll be discussing that a little bit later. So thank you so much, Aditi, for being here. We're so happy to have you. And then we have two policy and research coordinators for Fashion Revolution. And Fashion Revolution is basically the largest fashion activism organization out there. And so Delphine and Ciara bring a wealth of knowledge in terms of environmental issues and human rights issues that the fashion industry sees. So we're so happy to have them. Ciara is really interested in female empowerment in the supply chain, since many of the supply chains in the world are female led. And Delphine has a really keen interest on environmental issues, which is so amazing. So without further ado, we're going to get into it. We've had a nice introduction. And so we are presenting our Are My Clothes Harmful event. So everyone get excited because I am. Okay, so this question is for Roger and Delphine, and we can kind of go based on who's at the top and then who's underneath. So Roger, if you don't mind going first. So in your perspective, how does the fashion industry significantly impact environmental and planetary health?
And thank you for that. And thank you for the great introduction to everybody. It's fantastic. You know, the fashion industry has long been considered the second biggest polluter next to oil in the world. So it has a very significant impact on planetary health and the environment. The amount of pollutants that are released, a lot of chemical pollutants are released through rivers. There is very little for wastewater treatment facilities, and a lot of the fashion industry's manufacturing plants. So it is just so significant, it's unbelievable. And recently, it was about a few weeks ago, I was talking to a marine biologist, and we're talking about how the coral is dying because of the warming of water and all that kind of stuff. And I said, have you ever thought about, you know, the amount of pollutants that are also being released? Could that be having an impact on coral as well? So they're going to start looking at that, which I think is fantastic. And when we're filming RiverBlue, one of the things that really struck me was that the chemicals that are being released in the waterways, primarily in Southeast Asia, but it's around the world in various different places, they have been found in polar bears in the Arctic. So those pollutants are traveling around in the ocean currents. And it's not just in the ocean, it's also in the air. So there's all kinds of things that happen around the fashion industry, whether it's, you know, the burning of clothing at the end of its life cycle, or even sometimes at the beginning of its life cycle. So it is something that I don't think we can any longer kind of let the fashion industry go unchecked. And you know, a slogan of ours on RiverBlue is "Can fashion save the planet?" And I think we have to change how fashion is being produced currently, so that it can actually help save the planet.
Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you, Roger, for shining a light on that. Delphine, do you wanna add to that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I'm going to start off with a bit of context as to what we do know in terms of environmental impacts in the fashion industry and what we don't know. So we do know that environmental impacts in the fashion industry occur at the following stages of a garment's life cycle. So from extraction of raw materials to production of yarns, fabrics, garments, to the distribution of these garments around the globe, and then their use and their disposal. So all these stages have an environmental impact. And based on our research, obviously waste in the fashion industry is a massive issue. And we found that out of 250 of the largest fashion brands in the world, only 4% of them publish the amount of textile waste that they generate within a year, which is very, very striking stat. And the number of garments produced annually has more than doubled since 2000. And textile waste created annually has exceeded 100 billion for the first time in 2014. So when we think of these things, obviously, like the fashion industry is not just a waste issue. It's not just a water issue. All these environmental impacts are interconnected. However, there's often a disconnect between biodiversity and our clothes. But if you think about it, everything that we wear has been extracted from the ground at one point or another. So just looking at the environmental impact of viscose, for instance, 150 million trees are logged every year to be turned into textiles, according to the NGO Canopy. So this threatens the survival of endangered species and ancient forests, and we expect the demand of chemical pulp extraction to increase by 112% over the next 40 years. So, and this is just one fabric, and this fabric represents only 8% of the fabrics that we use in our garments. So as you can see, that the environmental impacts of the fashion industry are very, very far-reaching. Another example is the dyeing process, which uses hazardous chemicals, as Roger mentioned, and leads to water pollution. That's because there's very minimal water management in factories, and the water is discharged directly in rivers. And in the word of our founder, Ursula de Castro, you can look at the color of a river and predict the color of a collection. That's something that I heard as well watching your documentary, RiverBlue. However, there's a lot we don't know in terms of the extent of the environmental impact of the fashion industry. So for instance, as Roger mentioned, we often hear that the fashion industry is the second or third most polluting industry in the world. In reality, it's very, very hard to verify that statement because the industry is incredibly opaque. Brands do not track their environmental impacts, and they have no direct knowledge of how they're actually polluting. They tend to pass on the blame to their suppliers rather than taking accountability for their environmental impacts. Because of this, we found in our research for the Fashion Transparency Index, which reviews and ranks 250 of the largest fashion brands in the world, that there's very, very little publicly available information regarding environmental impacts, such as only 24% of them publish time-bound commitments to eliminate hazardous chemicals, and even less disclose their progress towards achieving these targets. Around 50% of brands publish their annual carbon footprint within their own operations and headquarters, but only 16% publish their carbon footprint within their supply chain. So to put that in context, we know that the greatest environmental impacts occur at the raw material and processing levels. But if a brand does not disclose this, and if they do not even measure it, it's very, very hard to be able to say the extent of these impacts. And finally, 31% of brands publish their water footprint in their own operations. What does that mean? That includes their offices, their headquarters, and distribution centers. But only 4% of companies publish their water footprint at raw material level. So again, based on this, we can really see why the fashion industry plays a massive role when it comes to climate change, and why at the moment it is completely unable to address these, because if you don't know something, you can't actually fix it. And finally, why do these impacts happen? Well, on one hand, lack of legislation to track, manage, and mitigate these environmental impacts. Consumers are pushed to consume, and brands are driven by profit. So if brands do not disclose their supply chains, their main reason is business secrets for competitive reasons. And if they don't uncover these environmental realities, they don't feel accountable to actually deal with them. And historically, we know that big brands have moved their production to countries with few environmental legislation, perpetuating colonial structures that extract labor and natural resources from countries in the global south, while maximizing the profits of wealthy, mostly white, mostly men, Western bosses, without being held accountable. This does not mean that environmental impacts don't happen on other continents. But to finish off, I would like to say that we can't separate environmental and human rights impacts, as the fashion industry is, intrinsically linked with these two aspects. And the lack of visibility means that it's very, very hard to manage both of these aspects. A great example is health and safety concerns in factories, where we can see that factories release toxic chemicals directly in rivers, while not giving the right PPE to their workers. And this raises not only severe concerns in terms of biodiversity loss, but also in terms of human rights violations. So I'll finish off with a quote from our founder, Carrie Summers. So we need to treat nature as a stakeholder.
Wow, thank you so much, Delphine, and thank you, Roger. I think a lot of what Delphine says ties into Roger's work, highlighting, the impact of the fashion industry on the rivers. And it's not just that the environment is separate, we're one with nature. We are directly linked. To think that humans are separate it's a mistake. So thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate that. We're going to go to our next question. So, or actually, no. So, before Roger's question, just to give everyone some context, hopefully you can hear this. So, Sophia will just give me a reaction in her window. But we're just going to watch the trailer for RiverBlue to give everyone a context as to, a little bit about his work and what it focused on.
We have a very small amount of water, and that's got to accommodate the needs that humans have for drinking water, and a lot of that water is not accessible.
We are committing hydrocide. We are deliberately murdering our rivers.
Our rivers across the world were being deeply impacted by the dumping of poisonous toxic material.
Every single piece of clothing that you buy comes with a cost.
The fabric dyes used contain hazardous materials, things like mercury, cadmium, and lead.
These kind of chemicals, they don't break down, and they travel around the world.
This water is so toxic, there is no aquatic life.
If you see how people are living there, they have lost their sensory adaptation. They can't smell anymore.
They do have problems with drinking water supply. There's a high incidence of liver cancers.
If we continue like this, it's done. It's done.
Maybe it's because the demand of the world has gone crazy.
The statistics are insane. Something like 80 billion garments of clothes are being delivered out of factories.
Those products are actually sold to the world's biggest brand names.
A lot of companies do things that are very, very hidden and very secret.
So the pipe is underground. You cannot really see this factory that is dumping this.
You don't learn the details because at the end of the day, it's not a selling point.
The consumer did not wake up one morning saying, I want to buy 5 pairs of jeans for a fraction of the price. We were literally introduced to this concept by the fashion industry.
If you have 2 jeans, one is damaging the planet, the other one not, and the price is the same, no one will choose the wrong one. I mean, there's no excuse.
I think all corporations have to be accountable for their environmental practices, and no one has a right to damage or destroy a river.
That was very intense music, but I really liked it. So that gives everybody a little bit of education on Roger's work and what that film was about. So this question is for Roger. So Roger, what was something that shocked you when filming RiverBlue? Can you tell us about something you feel is relatively hidden about the fashion industry from your firsthand experience?
Well, there's a lot of things that are hidden in the fashion industry and how it really operates. There's no question about that. And we kind of just scratched the surface, I think. There's a lot more to actually uncover around the fashion industry. But really, the biggest thing that shocked me when we were filming is something that you can't really get across in a film. It's very difficult, and that's smell. The smells that we encountered in these fashion manufacturing areas was absolutely horrific. Dhaka, Bangladesh was probably the worst area that I've been to, and the smell was just of chemicals, and it was burning. It burned my eyes, it made my throat really sore, and we were there for about 10 days. And I had a constant headache the whole time I was there. So yeah, it's true. In the film, it says, they've lost their, sensory adaptation. They can't smell anymore. It's absolutely true. Their eyes are burning. They can't breathe properly. It's a terrible place to live in. And one of the things, again, that also shocked me was the age of people. Their lifespan is not very long in a lot of these places. We were considered very old over there, and because most people don't live past 50 in those kind of environments because of the chemicals, because they're breathing them, they're really ingesting them, it's in their food supply. It is, it's a horrible place to live. There's no question about it, but they have to. And so, again, I think the brands have a responsibility back to the people, and they should be making sure that there's better wastewater treatment facilities, and that the chemical usage is reduced, and that they're not just throwing their garbage and chemicals in the rivers, or burning and polluting the air, or whatever they're doing. But yeah, it was really shocking, actually. And I've been to a lot of places in the world, and I've seen a lot of kind of undesirable things. But for RiverBlue, it really was the smell that just was atrocious.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think, most people would expect the rivers and the environment to be a certain way, but I think maybe what people don't always think about is the human aspect, and how it impacts the health of the workers, and how unjust and dangerous working in those conditions is. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because Aditi is going to shed some light onto. This is just a picture of one of the rivers. Aditi is going to share some light later on, how decolonizing the fashion industry is so important, and shed some light on the human aspect of this all. So before we get there, so this is a question on human rights. So this is for Aditi and Ciara. So what are the social implications of the fashion industry, and how does it intersect with gender, racial, labor justice, and human rights? And Aditi, you can go first, and then Ciara, you can go after, if you don't mind.
Yeah, great question. I think it's really important to start with the fact that the fashion industry exists in a racialized context. The majority of folks that are working in the fashion supply chain are people of color globally, and it also exists in a gendered context. So we know that upwards of 80% of garment workers are women. And so when we have this framing in mind, it's really important to look at the hierarchies of oppression that currently frame our world, and how that inevitably ties to the fashion industry. And so right now, the dominant fashion model operates on the global race to the bottom, which is the idea that brands are looking to produce as much as they can, as fast as they can, as cheap as they can. And this often means going to countries that have been destabilized by colonial violence and heading to more poorer parts of the world to plunder. And that's not because of better infrastructure or factories. It's because these are sacrifice zones, which is the idea that there are places around the world whose vulnerable populations undergo resource extraction, both of labor and their natural environment, as the means for this infinite growth for the West. And that's tied to fast fashion systems. But I think it's incredibly important to understand the colonial history that the fashion industry is operating on. We often talk about colonialism as this distant abstraction of the past, and we talk about fast fashion as this phenomenon that started in the 80s. But I like to bring our gaze a bit further back on how the first systems of fast fashion, in terms of an industry predicated on speed and scale, at the cost of quality, at the cost of the environment and garment worker lives, began much earlier. So as a woman of South Asian descent, my family is from India, I often like to talk about how when the British Empire came to India in the 16th century, the 1600s, at this time, India inherently had a very localized fashion model where it was tied to sustenance farming, and people would grow indigenous varieties of fibers like linen, cotton, jute, and it was a very much artisan rooted industry. So you had a myriad of different artisan practices that were regionally based. So when the British Empire came, they were particularly interested in our textile industry, which made up 25% of the world's economy at that time, between spices and textiles. And so essentially a systemic plan was created that would coerce Indian farmers that were largely subsistence farming at that time, so growing indigenous varieties of what both their immediate families and immediate communities needed, and coerce them into growing the cotton crop specifically. This was one of the first examples of monocropping or cash cropping. And essentially under this plan, India was to export only the raw material of cotton to the mills of Lancashire or Westminster in Britain. And they would sell that cotton back to India at a premium that left our own spinners and weavers unable to afford that cloth. And it's really important to understand the pattern of exploited labor that went on to happen, because if you fast forward in the history just a little bit, in the Americas, you then had the forced removal of America's indigenous communities to make room for plantations, most of which were cotton plantations, which then led to the slave trade in the Americas. And the US-Britain cotton relationship began. So now cotton was being imported to Britain from the Americas, and that positioned Britain as the workshop of the world. So we need to understand how the thread of cotton was once really rooted in livelihood, of culture, and it became the thread of empire and oppression. The empire was one of cotton. And I think it's really important to have this historical backing because it deeply, deeply informs a lot of the inequalities we see in the fashion supply chain today. And so that's a colonial history that we have, but colonialism continues to exist on how the fashion industry operates. I mentioned the global race to the bottom. I mentioned the sacrifice zones that continue to exist. But I think it's really important to understand how there has been a very intentional power dynamic that has framed the world. So in the 80s and 90s, this was a time where a lot of countries in the quote unquote global South were kind of establishing their formal independence from colonial states. So for example, India was a very young nation, Bangladesh was a very young nation. And at that time, because of colonial violence, there was a lot of destabilization in these countries and they needed loans to build their own infrastructure. And so there were institutions like the IMF and the World Bank that said, we will give you these loans under these set of conditionalities, which was tied to this idea of structural adjustments. So around the world, we saw major shifts on how countries were operating on an agricultural level due to these conditionalities set by these institutions. And Bangladesh was actually one of the first nations to undergo structural adjustments. And what happened under this is certain economic zones were created where companies did not have to pay taxes, where there was a lack of environmental regulation, where it was very, very tough for workers to unionize. And this is what set the conditions for Bangladesh to become a hotbed for sweatshops as we know today. So I think it's very easy to have a simplistic understanding of this, like, okay, Bangladesh is a hotbed for sweatshops. But we really need to understand the forces at play that set the conditions for that to take place. It did not happen overnight. And so if we are not actively interrogating the systems of power that create these inequalities and perpetuate them in the modern day, we're not doing enough. So I'll stop it there, but I think it's really important to understand how all of these systems kind of intersect. And it's very important to look at the history to know where we've been and where we are right now.
Thank you so much, Aditi. I love that you bring up intersectional backgrounds coming together to solve this problem. If we look at our panel, I'm already seeing some intersectionalities in terms of all of your backgrounds. So I'm so happy that you're all sharing this knowledge with each other and with our audience. So Ciara, yeah, could you also shed some light on this question?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's just, really interesting to hear, Aditi. I think it's really good framework to think about it within. So there are so many intersecting social issues at play in fashion supply chains. I mean, I could go on forever. So if I just touch on three, if we think firstly about the issues of like health and safety. So we know that workplaces are not safe and structurally sound for people in the fashion supply chains, and that workers are being asked to work without appropriate kind of protective equipment. So things like chemicals and dyes have been touched on. And I guess we're speaking in Fashion Revolution Week, which is a week to commemorate the 8th anniversary this year of the Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh, and reflect and remember the 1,138 people, mainly young women, who were injured, and many more, who died, and many more were injured in what was a preventable accident. And actually the day before, the whole building was evacuated because there were visible cracks in the building and there was questions about its structural integrity. And the Rana Plaza complex, it had 5 garment factories in, but it also had banks and shops within the same building. And only the garment workers from the factories, again, majority young women of color, were sent back into Rana Plaza and told they would risk losing their jobs if they didn't go back in. And the other workplaces, so, you know, this wasn't the same for banks. So they had a different demographic of workers. They had a higher proportion of male workers who exercised authority to insist we're not going back in, we don't feel safe. And thankfully, those bank workers weren't in the building the day it collapsed. And I think that really demonstrates just how these issues, these identities really intersect, and we have to think about it in an overlapping way. Another example is kind of the inescapable violence and abuse in the fashion industry. So we know that fashion supply chains, unfortunately, are rife with violence and abuse, and workers are regularly facing verbal, sexual, and physical violence at work. And we know that workers can't escape this, particularly those in kind of forced and bonded labor. So, for example, migrant workers. So a topical example at the moment, which people might have heard of, is the Uyghur region, which is a territory in northwest China, which is a major world producer of cotton. So, you know, because this cotton is weaving its way into our wardrobes, our clothes, our high streets. And at the moment, more than 1 million Uyghur people, which are a Muslim ethnic minority, are trapped in detention facilities by the Chinese government in the Uyghur region. You might know it as Xinjiang also. And multiple investigations, human rights campaigners have, you know, big organizations have shown that this is a regime of state-imposed forced labor. This is unpaid work, picking cotton and, you know, lots of other types of forced labor. And the conditions in these labor programs are rife with violence and abuse, horrendous human rights abuses, so surveillance, sexual abuse, forced sterilization, torture. And I think this demonstrates how inescapable this violence is. You know, these workers are in detention centres and state-imposed forced labour. They can't leave. But outside of that kind of very specific context, that workers across supply chains globally simply do not make living wages, you know, enough to live on. Research from Clean Clothes Campaign just last year showed that no major clothing brand in the world was able to show that their workers were paid enough to escape poverty. And you know, that is the vast majority are in the global south, but there's also production in the global north, like here in the UK, in Leicester. There was modern slavery found last year uncovered. So this issue is just enormous. And finally, if I have time, we'll just quickly come on to discrimination. So again, fashion supply chains are filled with prejudice and discrimination. They really intersect the lives of the workers. And we know that the reality is some workers face more struggles than others, and that's because of their identity. So people might be aware of a recent kind of high profile case of the rape and murder of a 21-year-old Dalit garment worker in a spinning mill in Tamil Nadu, a really tragic case. And I know a lot of you will be aware of this, but just for those that aren't, I'll just quickly speak about caste systems, because I think they're really important here. So caste systems, which are common in South Asia, are systems that divide people into sort of like unequal hierarchical social groups. And those of the lowest castes, known as the Dalits, are considered impure and untouchable, and they face really widespread discrimination because of this. So where they can live, who they can marry, what kind of work they can do. And after the tragic death of that 21-year-old Dalit worker, many of her colleagues came forward and said, actually, yes, I've been harassed by the supervisor, I've been sexually harassed, I've been verbally harassed. And what's so significant to me, and I was almost like banging my head at the screen when I was reading these articles about it, because it did reach kind of mainstream press, was that every single person involved was a Dalit woman, all of them. And yet not one article I read spoke about this enormous aspect of her identity and the survivor's identity. And I think it's just really shows that, you know, all women are vulnerable to gender-based violence, but Dalit women are at heightened risk of gender-based violence. And so we just really need to think about these issues, I think, in an intersectional way, and think about these imbalances of power, you know, that brands hold the most power, because if we want things to change, we need to hear from these marginalized voices and we need to protect their rights.
Wow, Ciara, thank you so much. And Aditi, you both provided such a thoughtful and rooted lens into this issue. We know that it's systemic, and, you know, it's not just what may seem on the surface. And I think that as much as we don't like it, you know, the fashion industry is the second largest polluter and also just destroyer of human rights and unequal treatment of people in the world. And, you know, our choices do matter, and we will get into that a little bit later, but just thank you so much for showing all of those intersections for our audience. It's really, really important that we are aware of the issue and we understand the impacts of our choices and also the practices of big brands and big corporations. So this question is for Aditi, and you can maybe talk a bit more about, you know, what does decolonizing fashion mean? And also, as a fashion and climate justice labor rights activist, how do you center intersectionality in your work? And also, how can other people do the same?
Yeah, definitely. So when I talk about decolonizing fashion, it's first important to understand what I mean by colonial practice, which I think is really understanding a system predicated upon the extraction and exploitation of resources, be it human labor or the natural environment, for this infinite growth and success, as I previously mentioned. And so to decolonize fashion, in my opinion, is to decolonize the two essential elements that make up fashion, and that is land and labor, in my opinion, if I were to really dilute it down. And so on the land element, I think we need a cognitive shift of how we essentially view land. One of the projects of colonialism was, you know, the shift of seeing land as inert, dead material, something to be extracted from. It was divesting from this idea of biocultural diversity, which is the idea that our, you know, natural landscapes are deeply, deeply rooted with the cultural context of the indigenous communities that live there. And in order to properly understand what symbiotic relationship we need to the land, we need to listen to the communities that have lived there for millennia and have developed the tools, the language, and relationship to really, you know, hold that relationship near and dear. And I think we also need to decolonize our understanding of labor, and to do that with an intersectional lens. As mentioned, there are a lot of systems of oppression that the fashion industry is further multiplying. You know, these multi-layered oppressions that are really rooted in this industry. And so to decolonize the fashion industry would mean a lot of different things. If I draw from just one specific example with pre-colonial times in India, you had an inherently localized form of production rooted in indigenous farming practices. And I think oftentimes in the fashion industry, we like to ask questions like, what's the most eco-friendly fiber? And I think that's a very binary, one-size-fits-all approach that we need to go beyond. We need to ask more contextual questions of what is indigenous to this region? What is the climate? What is the historical context that something might have? Because that requires a lot more intersectionality in our understanding. As far as the second question of how I center intersectionality in my work, I guess I'd first want to draw attention to the framework of intersectionality, which was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, an amazing Black woman scholar of critical race theory. And intersectionality essentially points to the ways that different elements of our identity, be it race, identity, socioeconomic background, whatever it may be, informed our lived experience. And so when it comes to applying this framework of intersectionality to the work in the fashion industry, it's going beyond one-size-fits-all solutions. It's the understanding that the communities that are being affected are the bearer of their own solutions. I always like to frame it as a biodiversity of thought. In this critical juncture for both people and the planet, we cannot expect one-size-fits-all solutions or solutions from the West, or solutions rooted in these technological miracles to save us. It is deeply rooted at its core of a very colonial understanding of how the world should operate, a very mechanistic view of the role that people play. And so I think that's the shift that needs to happen. And so much of the Western sustainability narrative is often rooted on how do we buy our way into a new reality, or what are those technological solutions to have a more sustainable future. And I think we're always going to miss that mark with that approach. It's really about centering BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color around the world, whose cultures have historically always had a symbiotic relationship with the natural world, and fashion systems reflected that. So I think it's really important to center that within our work, especially in the context of Fashion Revolution Week too, you know, how we're really posing those solutions and which voices we are centering at the end of the day.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I think decolonizing your relationship, whether it's with the environment, whether it's dealing with the fashion industry, decolonization is at the root of all of those things because we're all living on stolen land. So, I mean, I'm a settler, so I am. And so, thank you so much for shedding light on that. I think it's really important to know that. And I think if you can root whatever actions you take to make a positive change in your life, based on those principles that you've shared and Ciara shared and Delphine and Roger, I think, you know, we will all be better off and we'll be able to make more just solutions that include everybody's well-being. So thank you. So this question is geared towards Fashion Revolution. So Delphine and Ciara, you're both from Fashion Revolution. As the world's largest fashion activism movement, how does your work advocate for gender, labor, racial, and environmental justice? And then I don't know if audience members know about the Are My Clothes or the Who Made My Clothes campaign, but that came out a few years ago and it has been taking over the internet, especially during this week. And so our webinar, Are My Clothes Harmful, is an homage to Fashion Revolution's Who Made My Clothes campaign. What was the impact of that campaign and also what inspired it?
Great. Well, I'm going to take the first part of the question and then pass it on to Ciara. So our work focuses on three things: culture change, policy change, and industry change. So on a culture change level, so we know there's a need to change the industry standards, the policies that govern what businesses can and can't do. And by launching public campaigns like Who Made My Clothes, we're advocating for cultural change to raise awareness and shed light on these issues, as well as centering our work around the voices of workers that have not been able to express themselves before. So by doing this, we're also able to call for greater transparencies from brands and retailers. And our latest campaign, Who Made My Fabric, focuses on publicly disclosing the processing facilities and textile mills of over 60 major fashion brands. So anyone can get involved by, for instance, emailing brands, leaving a review on a brand's website, as they do tend to pay attention to that as well, and by also using the hashtag of our campaign. So another level where we do our work focuses on is campaigning for legislation. So, for instance, Fashion Revolution advocated for the adoption of the Modern Slavery Act, which was passed in 2015. So this was designed to tackle slavery and human trafficking for businesses within their supply chains. So that means that businesses have to issue a statement with the steps taken to combat modern slavery, and this statement has to be signed off by a board member. And this really brings the topic of modern slavery at the boardroom level, which wasn't done before. And by campaigning for these different legislations, we also aim to strengthen the implementation of these legislations, as it's so crucial to achieving different forms of justice within the fashion industry, as legislations do rule the way industries and societies operate. So although we have been working for a long time on pushing these legislations forward, it is a long game effort, and it has been something that we're a bit less vocal about, but we do work on it sort of in the background. And then lastly, industry change. So obviously, as there is a lack of visibility in supply chains, and that allows for exploitative, unsafe working conditions and environmental damage to thrive, while obscuring who has the responsibility and power to redress these issues. So this is why we operate from within and outside the industry to really promote change. So for instance, from within, the Fashion Transparency Index, we do collect publicly available information, and then we're able to collaborate and discuss directly with brands what their next steps are going to be. We often have calls with brands discussing how they're dealing with, their tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 suppliers, if they're planning on publishing this list, and any potential strategy that they have to mitigate their environmental impacts. And this really allows us to have a direct relationship with brands and influence them. And on the other hand, we collaborate with NGOs, trade unions, and other civil society organizations to use our research, such as the Fashion Transparency Index, and really scrutinize what brands are actually doing on the ground in terms of mitigating their environmental and human rights impacts. And by doing this, we can really amplify what they're doing on the ground and really look into where our clothes are made, who makes them, and in what conditions. So by incentivizing transparency, we're really increasing the accountability of brands and making these brands accountable to all their stakeholders, from customers, shareholders, NGOs, trade unions, and their own workers across their supply chains. So as I mentioned before, you're welcome to join our campaign, especially the Who Made My Fabric campaign, which we just launched. I'm sure we'll be able to send any link for anyone who would like to be involved.
Thank you so much, Delphine. Yeah, we'll definitely post that in the chat later. So yes.
Right. And I'll pass on to Ciara now.
Sounds good.
Great, yeah, and just to say thank you so much. Like, we're so overwhelmed at Fashion Revolution, the amount of events that are taking place all over the world, and it's so exciting and inspiring to see them, this movement to take place everywhere. So I'm glad that it inspired the Are My Clothes Harmful?
Oh, I think
years ago in Bangladesh, what we had was people looking through the rubble for clothing labels to can you hear me okay? It says my internet is unstable.
You froze for just a quick second, but you look cute.
Sorry. I'm just saying that 8 years ago, when Rana Plaza collapsed, we had people literally on their hands and knees digging through rubble to pull out brands' clothing labels. And in some cases, it took weeks to determine who was making there, what the purchasing agreements were, where the accountability was. And the harsh reality is that if brands don't know where our clothes are being made, they cannot work to fix the problems before they end in tragedies like Rana Plaza. And as consumers, as citizens, if we don't know what brands are producing where, if trade unions, civil society organizations, they don't know, we can't hold them accountable when something goes wrong. We couldn't immediately hold up these brands and say, this is a horrendous human rights abuse, what are you doing on the ground? Because we didn't even know, we were rummaging through rubble to see what labels were there. So that is what inspired the Who Made My Clothes campaign. It was this absolute need for transparency. And in terms of the impact, I mean, the campaign has been hugely successful. Like, its reach is enormous. I think at last check, just now, I checked, it had 760,000 Instagram posts. And that's posts alone. There will be more on Instagram stories, on Twitter, on other social media platforms. But also, I think its impact has such value in that it's given makers, who are often, they're a vital part of the operation. They make the clothes, but they're often nameless and faceless. And the opportunity that this hashtag gave to, for them to respond with the hashtag I made your clothes, to kind of humanize this, labor intensive industry, I think that's a big part of its impact. And we know it's working. We recently did some research on the transparency efforts of 60 major brands, and 2/3 of them are now publicly disclosing their factory lists, showing on their websites the names and addresses of who made their clothes, not the names of the workers, the names of the factories and the addresses. And that is just a completely different, situation and story from 8 years ago. And, Delphine and I can't take all the credit for that because we're very new to Fashion Revolution, but that really is a legacy of Fashion Revolution, asking this hashtag Who Made My Clothes. And in terms of like how you guys can get involved, I mean, Delphine and I have continuously plugged this hashtag Who Made My Fabric campaign, but unfortunately, although we're there with factory lists, or we're getting there with 2/3 of big brands publishing on their website, in terms of textile production sites like spinning mills, only about 1/3 of the brands in our research disclose some of those sites and addresses, But and that's why we've launched the hashtag Who Made My Fabric campaign, because we really are looking to extend this transparency now to textile production sites, where workers are not only more hidden, but they're actually often in, they face worse conditions. So yeah, I mean, third plug of the webinar to say, please get involved with our hashtag Who Made My Fabric campaign, because we'd love to see transparency extended to that level, and kind of the safeguarding of human rights and environmental rights at, a deeper part of the supply chain.
Yes, for sure. Thank you, Ciara. I think it's really easy to dehumanize the fashion industry because you don't see the people behind it. You don't see that transparency. You don't know, you kind of assume it's just a machine making your clothes and then they just roll them out on a factory line. But that's definitely not the case. And so I think this push for transparency will inspire, hopefully, many people to be able to demand more. I know even for myself as an individual, as soon as I know something's harmful, I can't in good conscience continue that action or that behavior. So I think this is definitely a crucial step, and there is hope. So at the end, we definitely want to have more of a question for everybody, talking about like what we can do and how we can take action on all of these things. But thank you so much for sharing that. We're at our second last question. This has been amazing so far. I know that I'm not speaking just for myself. We might just go like 10 minutes later just because we have a few audience questions. Hope that that's okay if you have to go. That is a-okay. So this question is about changes, and it's for Aditi and Roger. So what changes have you both made as an individual, knowing more deeply the social and environmental implications of the fashion industry, and how has your work changed as a result of this?
Yeah, I mean, I could start. I would say when I first started in this space, shortly after Rana Plaza happened 8 years ago, what I saw was this very distinct binary of, we in the global north have to address what's happening in the global south. And it was rooted in a lot of problematic narratives that were rooted in white saviorism without really acknowledging what's also happening in our own borders. And so I wanted to go beyond the narrative of just voting with our own, with our dollar and acting locally. And so I'm based in LA, where the second largest industry is actually the cut and sew garment industry in Los Angeles. We have a workforce of upwards of 50,000 individuals, which is probably a gross underestimation of the true number. And that's because it's a largely underground and informal economy with a largely undocumented workforce. So we have an industry rife with sweatshops here in downtown Los Angeles. And so my focus really, came to grassroots organizing and supporting the garment worker community here. And since we were talking about policy and, ways we could help, materially shift the fashion industry, I wanted to plug some policy work that's happening here in downtown LA. In downtown LA, we have an industry that is actively being challenged by the garment worker community. And often we talk about this idea of corporate social responsibility within the sustainable fashion narrative, which is incredibly important. But the limits of corporate social responsibility is that it is often voluntary measures made by brands that mirror local law and have a lack of legally binding documents or third-party auditing processes. I think we really need to push the idea of worker-driven social responsibility or worker-driven sustainability, which is rooted in the idea that the communities that are disproportionately being affected by these issues need to establish the shifts that they want to see in creating a culture of equity and accountability. So the Garment Worker Protection Act in LA would do a few things. The first thing it would do is it would abolish the piece rate. Here in LA, most workers are paid per piece they make as opposed to the hour. And that piece rate is as low as 2 to 3 cents when we talk to garment workers that have been in the industry for the last 20, 30 years. And so when you have the piece rate in mind, the average rate a garment worker in LA is making right now is anywhere from $5 to $6. So this new piece of policy would abolish the piece rate and set the minimum wage as the price floor. It would create a direct line of accountability between what happens in the factory and the brand. And this would set a precedent because this has not been done in terms of legally binding documents. And that's incredibly important. In my work as a photojournalist, I've covered a lot of the resistance here in LA for the last 4 or 5 years. And one of the campaigns that has made up about 3 years of that was against Ross Dress for Less. And there is a campaign where 4 garment workers were collectively owed $800,000 in unpaid wages from Ross, 4 workers. And that wasn't a claim, it was a case they took to the labor court and won. What happened is there was a lack of accountability because Ross blamed the factory and nothing was paid up from Ross's end. So this is an example of the type of situations where there would be, legally binding mechanisms to make sure that brands do pay up in those instances. So I'll include more information in the chat below, but I think wherever you are, definitely look into local issues in your locality that you could help organize against, because I think those modes of direct action and grassroots organizing is essential to make the shifts we want to see. And I think it's also really important to shift our own capacity and the way we view ourselves as not just consumers, but as citizens that can materially shift the very, very important shifts that we need at this point in time. And as important as conscious consumerism is, it will not save us at the end of the day, because we need to acknowledge the fact that it's amazing that we have the sustainable fashion industry, but it points to the fact that the traditional fashion industry has normalized violence as business as usual. And that's something we need to interrogate every day.
Wow, that's incredibly impactful. Thank you for that. And certainly I know a little bit about what's going on in LA and the garment workers down there. So again, thank you for all the good work that you're doing. When I started RiverBlue, I wanted to do an environmental film on water. And of course, I've never done one before, so I didn't know exactly what I was getting into. But coming out of that, what I have is not only respect for all the people that are involved in the fashion industry and work the way that they have to work, unfortunately, but I have a great respect now for water and the conservation of clean drinking water. And even in my country of Canada, there are many, many communities that do not have clean, safe drinking water. So, wherever I can, I'm trying to help out in that regard and try to shed a little light on, again, clean drinking water, which really led me back to doing another film with Mark Angelo called Last Paddle, which is really about river conservation and river restoration, and so that we can get back to having cleaner, safer drinking water. And personally, for myself, if I'm shopping now, I shop in a completely different way, and I do a lot more research. There's a website I've gone to numerous times called Good On You, which I think is really a great database and a great resource for people when they are looking for clothing. And again, I'm not buying as much as I once did, and I'm certainly wearing things a little longer. And I can sew, I can put a button back on. So there's all kinds of ways that we can all personally help out and change and make the world a better place. And certainly through this panel, there's been some amazing dialogue.
Yeah, I'm floored by the amount of awareness and education even I've received in this panel. So thank you so much for everybody. I love, Aditi, how you share, the importance of local grassroots organizing. And then also just touching on how conscious consumerism won't fix this problem, because at the end of the day, you're still buying a product, you're still showing that there is a demand for it. And so you need to go above and beyond, and policy is a really big area that we can induce change. I even love seeing, Roger, how you hadn't done an environmental film before RiverBlue, and then now you're doing another environmental film, which I think is amazing. And in terms of clean drinking water, it's not just about like the fashion industry, but the fashion industry does impact the availability of clean drinking water, which is a human rights issue. And even in Canada, the government did sign on to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, also known as UNDRIP. And yet there are still around like 60 plus Indigenous communities in Canada that don't have clean drinking water this year. So it's definitely a big systemic issue, and one that we need to tackle in a holistic way, rooted in decolonizing our practices of just the way we live our lives and how we do business and how we do everything. So thank you both so much. This leads us to our last question. I'm so grateful for everybody here. So this is for everybody. So we can do Aditi, Delphine, Ciara, and Roger, just for an order. But looking at possibilities and innovation, how can we move towards an ethical fashion ecosystem, and is that even possible? And then we have touched on this, so kind of understanding what needs to be done on an individual but also systemic basis, so we can just tie in all of our answers together. So yeah, please do share. Aditi, we'll start with you.
Most definitely. I think in many movements, we often create this rift between individual versus systemic change. And it's like a very stark binary. It's either one or the other. But going back to what I was saying earlier, when we focus on our actions, not as consumers, but as citizens or community members, and those actions are things like grassroots organizing, policy work, mutual aid, and direct actions, these individual actions will materialize systemic change. It's not lost on me that, amid this conversation, we can't ignore the fact that it's 100 companies that contribute to 70% of carbon emissions. And I think capitalism has brainwashed folks into thinking all of the onus needs to be on consumers, which is false. So I think it's really important to, frame that, but that doesn't mean individual action doesn't mean anything. In terms of what can, or how to move towards an ethical fashion ecosystem, there's so much that was talked about in this panel today. In terms of concrete examples of folks that are decolonizing the industry, I'll include some resources in the chat, but I'll do another plug, I guess. Next year in 2022, I'll be spending 1 year in India as a National Geographic Fellow, doing a lot of journalistic work on the fashion supply chain and the social environmental impacts from agriculture, manufacturing to end of life. And a big focus of that project for me is going to be solutions-oriented journalism. Within the larger climate movement, I think there's a very large doomsday feeling of, well, there's nothing that we can do. And I think it's really important to highlight solutions-oriented stories, especially when it's coming from the community that is being disproportionately affected. And the last thing I guess I would close with is, the political project of capitalism often makes us feel like there is no alternative. In fact, that was a whole campaign championed by people like Margaret Thatcher. There was even an acronym, TINA, there is no alternative. And there's that quote that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Now, I know this is not a conversation about economic systems and capitalism, but I think it's important to include that thought because as important as it is to be aware of the issues that plague our society today, I think we all need to engage in the work of reimagination. It's a radical act and it's a lot more easier said than done. But I think it's really important to actively think about the systems that can exist when we center equity and intersectionality in our approach. And it's something that I'm challenging myself to do, and I hope others would take that on as well. But what's possible when we shift our relationship to fashion from a disposable commodity to seeing it as a piece of art, reflective of our identities, of cultures, of the amazing labor behind the label. Often there's this narrative of garment workers as unskilled labor. I don't know where that came from because if you try sewing your own garment, you will quickly see that it's an art form at the end of the day. And so I'll end with that.
Great. Well, I mean, I can only but echo what Aditi just said. I just agree with absolutely every single point. So I guess just to reiterate, especially from a fashion revolution perspective, so how can we move towards an ethical fashion ecosystem? Again, it does feel a bit overwhelming, especially as an individual, because we are not just consumers, we are, as Aditi very rightly said, individuals who are able not just to change the system with our wallet, but also campaign for the issues we believe in. So there's definitely a massive need for a shift in terms of legislation, and stay tuned because Fashion Revolution will do a bit more in that space in the following year. Again, from an industry and retailers perspective, there is so much work, and this is where collaboration comes in. I really believe, especially after this year, looking at our talks with brands, how important collaboration on mitigating the issues that are faced within supply chains. I think there's often a tendency for fashion brands to work in silos, and by collaborating on these issues, we can really shift the fashion ecosystem and avoid surplus production, for instance, look at the circular economy, look at new business models as well. I think collaboration between NGOs, collaboration between NGOs and brands between them as well is really, really key to achieving a more ethical fashion ecosystem. And on an individual basis as well, I think it's incredibly important. When we talk about fast fashion, we think of garments that don't have value, which is actually not true. These clothes have been made by an individual, and it's your responsibility to care for these garments, to make them as long lasting as possible, and to really look after them, as Ursula de Castro would say, love clothes last. And I think it's really true. We often assimilate fast fashion with something that is completely disposable, but as an individual, we really have the responsibility to make sure that this isn't the case. It's not something that is as disposable and it shouldn't be. So lastly, I'll just say that basically we need to make sure as individuals that we should wear what we already own, make sure that we make our clothes as long lasting as possible, and campaign for a world we believe in.
Thank you so much, Delphine. That was beautiful. And Aditi, that was also beautiful. I am overwhelmed. Ciara, do you want to touch on this question as well?
Yeah, sure. I actually dropped off the internet a few minutes ago, so I kind of missed some of that. So I'm really sorry if I repeat what you said, Delphine or Aditi. But I think, I mean, as Aditi was saying, intersectionality has got to be absolutely front and center of this. I think clearly, I mean, we spoke about these multifaceted identities that, you know, people are working within, and if we fully protect human rights and nature rights, I think that has got to be absolutely front and center. And secondly, just in terms of transparency, so as I say, Delphine, we kind of need a widespread change in culture where supply chain transparency is genuinely adopted as a sort of pre-competitive space, where, you know, information is openly disclosed. And I think, as was said earlier, this, you know, CSR is great, but it's all very voluntary. And what we need to get to is a position where this is like legally mandated. I mean, there's a blog on the Fashion Revolution website at the moment called #ProtectProgress, and it's about the Bangladesh Accord, which came into play after Rana Plaza collapsed, which is this kind of binding agreement between trade unions and brands and suppliers to say that, you know, they're all legally responsible for each other. And it's at risk now because it's about to transition into you know, brands signing up voluntarily and kind of policing themselves rather than there being that legal mandate. And so I think what we really do need to see is this to move beyond voluntary CSR and actually, you know, put legal structures in place.
Yeah, for sure. No, I definitely agree. I think legalizing or putting policy in action shows the values of what the civilians want, and kind of touching on what Aditi said, you know, we haven't talked about economics too much, but the way capitalism was kind of introduced was based on oppression and was based on colonization. And so we are seeing those values come out today, whether it's through business practices or other ways of, you know, anything. And so I think, you know, what's so important is understanding like our values need to change. That's a very systemic solution to this problem, is, you know, the way we value people, the way we value goods, the way we value consumerism in general in our lives will play into kind of how we see capitalism manifest. And so I think what you have all touched on is so important. Roger, I don't know if you want to just add some final words.
Sure.
And we will wrap up. We'll start wrapping up.
First of all, I think this has really, truly been an amazing panel, and it's been great to listen to everyone else on the panel. And thank you for all the wisdom that's out there. It's amazing. And again, I kind of go back to, can fashion save the planet? And I think it can. I think there's a way that we need to work, and Aditi touched on this, and that's, you know, the positive things that are coming or are already out there. And a lot of that really has to do with technology. And I think there's some great technology coming or at the forefront. There's certainly wastewater treatment facilities that need to get put into place. One of the people that I met when we're filming RiverBlue was a man in Italy, in Milan, Luigi Caccia, who has a company called Ital. And Italy is a very expensive place to live and work and create. But he was able to, I think he was the first one to have a really sophisticated wastewater treatment facility. He recaptured steam to help with energy. I mean, he just, all the best practices he has done. And he's doing it in Italy and paying, pretty big wages for his staff as opposed to other places in the world. And if he can do that in Italy, then it can be done in many, many other locations around the world. And again, I think we have to look to those positive technology changes that can be brought into play so that, again, fashion can help save the planet.
Yes, of course. I love that you brought that up. I saw that part of your documentary. He definitely has circularity checked off. I was amazed.
Absolutely.
I think what's amazing about this issue is you don't have to work in the fashion industry to make an impact, and I think that's the point. Is we have these amazing educators here, and you're all in this industry in some way, shape, or form. But whether you're a musician or a teacher or a scientist or like anything, you can either educate your community, or you can make different choices for yourself and your family, and you can sign on to like local petitions and things like that. And so I think that's what's so empowering about this whole thing is like you don't have to be working in this space to make the change that we do need to see. So just a bunch of gratitude for all of you today sharing everything and being here with us. We're gonna start wrapping up. If you do have to go, that is okay, because we did go a little bit over. I know we have one question, so hopefully you can all stay. So I will just, so this is our stay in touch page. You can follow us on at Threading Change on Instagram. If the panelists don't mind actually writing in the chat their preferred contact method for any audience members that want to keep in touch with your work, please share. And any of those links that you mentioned or anything that you want to highlight, please just share it in the chat now. And you can stay in touch with Threading Change. We have our emails up here. For all general inquiries, hello@threadingchange.org is probably the best one. And yeah, thank you everyone for coming. We have one final wrap-up event, and you can register for it, threadingchange.org/clothebusters. We have some workshops talking about mending and trying to, create that circularity with our own wardrobes, and we have some storytellers. So definitely check that out if you're free. We would love to have you. This is our Q&A period. So I think we had a question. So this was for Aditi. It was, Aditi, thank you so much for the history lesson and talking about decolonization. Do you believe a massive change can start at the bank and funding level? And that was one question we had.
This is a great question. I am no expert on bank and funding levels, but I can direct you to some resources that I think could be a good first step. I think this question came through when I was talking about the legacy of the IMF and the World Bank in terms of the shifts that had on economies across the world, especially in the global South. So I guess I'll point to some resources that are deeply embedded in the fashion industry. The first thing I would encourage folks to read up on is, if you're interested on the agricultural level of this, look into the Green Revolution. I'll type it in the chat. The Green Revolution was something that occurred between the 60s and 70s in a few different parts around the world. Punjab, India, where my family is from, and I come from a farming background, so that was something that hits quite close to home. It happened in Mexico, it happened in the Philippines and Pakistan, but this was also a result of conditionalities placed on loans given to countries that were, again, reeling from colonial violence and destabilization that deeply affected agricultural systems, which, as we know, is tied to fashion. You could read up, there's a lot of great academic journals if you're on that JSTOR energy, if you're interested in reading more about how structural adjustments affected Bangladesh, which was one of the first nations to undergo structural adjustments. If you're interested in the legacy of capitalism and how it's tied to colonialism, I have some books here. One is Empire of Cotton. This is a great text to read to understand the deeply oppressive history that cotton has. And the other one I would say is look into the work of Vandana Shiva, amazing scholar, ecofeminist, champion for small farmers around the world and biodiversity. She has a host of books that breaks down a lot of these systems of oppression. And top of mind, one is The Violence of the Green Revolution. One is Oneness versus the 1%. I hope that answers the question, if I'm understanding it correctly. Another great scholar that you can look into is, I'm forgetting her name top of mind, I'll type it in the chat, but she has a book all about microfinance in Bangladesh and its discontents. I think it's Lamia Karim. And she's an amazing Bangladeshi scholar who I was recently on a panel with, whose body of work really explores the economic legacy. And she also looks a lot at garment workers. So I hope those are a few good resources to start. But if I did not understand your question, feel free to send me an email and I'll be happy to look into it further.
Thank you so much. I love book recommendations so much. So I'm sure I'm not the only one super excited by that. This is just for any other panelists that want to add. So feel free to add to that question. And if you want to either type it in the chat or, verbally talk about some other information on the systems that influence the reality of the industry today. So someone asked for just like more resources and more information. So if you want to just quickly pop that in the chat, that would be amazing. And so, yeah, we're coming to a close. Thank you so much for everybody who has come to this webinar. I've been blown away. Thank you to our audience, our community, our panelists especially. We're really grateful to be funded by Van City for this Close Busters series. We couldn't do it without their support, so it means a lot to us. And yeah, I hope that you're all taking away with you something really valuable. I know that I am, and this will definitely inspire some change and some action in my life. But don't be a stranger. So definitely stay up to date with us. You can DM us on Instagram, or I'm sure you can probably try and DM Aditi. I know she's extremely busy, so I don't, but she's doing amazing work, and also Fashion Revolution. And we will be sending out an email with a promo code for RiverBlue for you all to be able to watch it. So I watched it a few weeks ago and I was blown away. So definitely recommend. And yeah, so that brings us to our close. Thank you everybody again. If you want to share in the chat, maybe something that you're taking away with you, whether it's an emotion or a new fact that's going to change your life, please share. And thanks again.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been amazing. Amazing panelists. So much gratitude. Yeah, and so we'll be sending some emails out with all of the chat information, so it's not gone. Don't worry at all. Bye, everybody.
Thanks again.
Bye, thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. I wish I could play music right now as like a exit.